Hello, it's Miss Heather, piano and voice teacher at Conservatory of the Ozarks, doing the second half of my last study guide video for Hymnody, hopefully. So my last two questions. First one is the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was a reaction against the Enlightenment or the rationalist movement of the late 1700s. So the rationalist movement had lots of different effects on hymnody during its era. Rationalists, they didn't like any reference to the supernatural, so they didn't want miracles, anything like that in their hymn texts. So they altered the meaning of some of the hymn texts. They removed stanzas to some of the hymns. They pretty nearly abandoned all of the Karen leader, and they just gutted the intended meaning of the original songs of the Lutheran faith and the Protestant Reformation. And they also had an effect on hymn tunes. They really liked the isorhythmic tunes. So this kind of helped to further the deterioration of hymn singing in German churches during this era. So the hymn singing really went downhill during the Enlightenment. So in the 1800s, the Oxford movement came along and they wanted to change all of that, all of these things that had happened during the Enlightenment. So the Oxford movement was also called the Tractarian movement in England, and it was from 1833 to 1841. There was Tracts for Our Time, and it was popular to write all these tracts and pass them out to your friends about various religious topics. And it was also called the Confessionalist movement in Germany. And the focus was to return to the past. So they restored the original stanzas that had been removed during the Enlightenment. They wanted to go even farther back than that. They felt that the Protestant reformers had thrown out too much from the past. So they went back to the early church, the ancient breviary, and wanted to bring back things from the Middle Ages and early Christians to their current day. They felt that the Protestant Reformation made too many changes, that they were concerned with the whole picture of worship, music, majesty, mystique. So they felt the buildings that people were worshiping in, the architecture was too stark and bare, and that worship should be beautiful and should affect all of your senses. They restored the original rhythmic tunes for the German chorales, and because of the focus on looking back to the early church, translation of hymns and other religious music was a big deal at this time. They weren't the only important people, but the two major players were Catherine Winkworth and John Mason Neale. Catherine Winkworth wrote Ora Lyrica when she was only 28 years old. It was a German to English translation of Reformation hymns, German Reformation hymns. And John Mason Neale found ancient hymns from the breviary to translate from Latin into the common vernacular. And many of Gerhardt's hymns were translated. They were translated into English. Like 90 of his hymns were translated by 50 different people. Catherine Winkworth and then John Kelly also translated his hymns, and so did Charles Wesley, like just to name a few. So his influence continued on into the 1800s. This movement culminated with the publication in the 1860s of Hymns Ancient and Modern, which was a very important English hymnal. It sold over 200 million copies, which was a record-breaking and incredible. And it still is in use to this day. And that hymnal, the process of coming up with that hymnal is something Christians today can take a lesson from. Choosing hymns can be a really political, knee-jerk kind of process, but it shouldn't be. We can learn from how they went back to the past to look for the best. They didn't choose things just because they were part of their own denomination. They didn't choose the best just because it was new or just because it was old. They looked at the old and the new. They looked at hymns from different languages and cultures, and they tried to find the best and include that into their hymnal and leave the rest behind. They included like Welsh hymns, which weren't really ever included in hymnals, and some hymns from the Celtic tradition, which also, like, they weren't included in like serious hymnals, I guess, up to that time. And many of the translated hymns from the early church would have been lost forever if it weren't for the Orthodox movement, like O Come, Emmanuel. So they contributed a lot of valuable things to hymnody, and their agenda coincided with the Pietists' agenda. And I think that's all I have for that one. And then my last question is the criteria for judging the suitability of hymns for worship. So, a hymn should be a good carriage of theology. It should lift the believer's eyes to heaven, away from the things of temporal life and up to the eternal things. A hymn should be able to reach a variety of people, both with its text and tune. The tune should be accessible. Someone like a child or someone who's not super musically talented should be able to sing the hymn. And it should be easily understood. Not necessarily Shelley, Keats, Shakespeare, which can be a little tricky to understand, for a 5-year-old or for a new believer who doesn't have a huge depth of knowledge. So a hymn must be able to speak to a new believer or a child or someone who doesn't have tons of formal education. It should be able to reach any kind of person right where they are. But, hymns should be poor man's poetry. But that doesn't mean it should be poor poetry. It should have simplicity and depth. It should have depth to be revisited over a lifetime of repetition, singing these same hymns over and over again in church every week. So simplicity to be easily understood right away, but the depth to reveal more layers of truth over time. The acid test for a hymn text is, can the text stand alone, or does it have to have its tune in order to stand the test of time? When I choose hymns, I need to look to the past, look to the present, and look for the best, and kind of leave the rest. I have to sift through the vast treasure house of the church's musical history and find only the best things to bring into the Lord's presence. And I have to ask myself when I choose hymns, what is my rationale? Am I looking for something that will help the congregation as a whole to participate? Or am I going to not have them participating? If I'm not going to have them participating, what's my rationale behind that? And And I think that's pretty much it that I can remember for that one. Wow. 6 little questions. That's a lot of talking. Like, my voice is sore from talking so much. I'm so glad to have answered all of them, and I think I answered them like satisfactorily enough to pass. It's pass fail, so it just has to be good enough to pass. Alright, thumbs up for the Oxford movement.